Imagine looking down at the Earth from space. Right now, in the narrow, incredibly tense waters of West Asia, military destroyers are actively escorting commercial cargo ships. Fighter jets are sweeping across the night sky, and if you look at global financial markets, they are just flashing red. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a geopolitical earthquake that kicked off in early 2026, and it's sending severe macroeconomic shockwaves across the entire globe. What we're looking at is a full-blown crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, and it is fundamentally reshaping how the world gets its energy. To really wrap our heads around the massive scale of this threat, we've got to look at the numbers. The Strait of Hormuz is arguably the world's most dangerous economic chokepoint. Under normal circumstances, a staggering 20%, one-fifth of all the oil consumed on the planet, flows right through this single narrow waterway. Now imagine putting a tourniquet on that major artery. We're talking about unprecedented disruption. Because when 20% of global oil is suddenly at risk, the fallout doesn't just stay in the Gulf. It crashes into literally every supply chain, every shipping route, and every fuel station on Earth. So the million-dollar question really is, can the world actually survive a total Hormuz shutdown? And the clock is ticking incredibly loudly on this one. Right now, global oil inventories are draining by roughly 2.6 million barrels every single day. That safety buffer we rely on? It's vanishing. We're operating with a ticking clock urgency here, drawing down from strategic national reserves while holding out hope for a diplomatic breakthrough that, so far, just hasn't materialized. But let's zoom in a bit and pivot our focus from the broad global stage to a specific, highly vulnerable giant. Is India prepared? Because India is the world's third largest consumer of crude oil, and its import dependency hovers dangerously close to 90%. Think about that, 90%. As we go through this explainer, we're going to closely examine India's specific vulnerabilities and the looming domestic economic fallout that has everyday citizens and top financial experts deeply concerned. Section 1. The new global energy war and its geopolitical shockwaves. We are witnessing a macro-level conflict that has effectively militarized the world's trade routes. Let's look at how incredibly fast this escalated. Back in February 2026, the US-Israel war on Iran began. By March, vessel transits through that region absolutely plummeted, from over 130 a day to single digits. By April, port blockades and a staggering 10.5 million barrels per day of oil shut in. Now, moving into May, we're seeing fragile ceasefire extensions and some very high-stakes talks in Washington, D.C. The speed of this is just breathtaking. In a matter of months, the core global supply chain was utterly compromised. Moving on to Section 2, choking the Strait of Hormuz, a maritime choke point. Geography is destiny, right? Nestled tightly between Iran and Oman, the Strait of Hormuz is the literal only sea passage from the Persian Gulf out to the open ocean. And nothing illustrates the severity of this crisis quite like this joint readout following a meeting in Beijing. The Strait of Hormuz must remain open to support the free flow of energy. Think about how rare that is. This is a moment of total geopolitical alignment between U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Despite all their broader rivalries, both superpowers recognize the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of open oil trade. The global economy simply cannot function without it. But then, you flip the perspective and look at Iran's position. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated, "The Strait of Hormuz is now suffering first and most from the U.S. aggression. Iran will not bow down." Iran is asserting that the U.S. naval blockade is actually what's responsible for the choke point. They're presenting a highly defiant stance, warning that this instability is a lose-lose proposition for everyone involved. What we have here is a massive gridlock of competing narratives and heavy military posturing. Section 3. Global markets react, or, as we can call it, the Bloomberg terminal reality. Because when you shift from the physical battleground to the digital trading floor, the reality hits hard. When the physical flow of oil stops, the digital flow of money absolutely panics. Look at the sheer velocity of this price jump. In February, the Brent crude spot price was sitting somewhat comfortably at $71 a barrel. By April, it had practically doubled to an agonizing $138 a barrel. That is not just a number on a screen. That right there is the raw fuel for potential global recession. Every single dollar increase drains billions from oil-importing economies. And here is the exact reason for that violent price spike. 10.5 million. That is the number of barrels per day of West Asian oil production that were shut in during April alone, meaning physically capped and completely halted. Just to put that into perspective, More than 10% of the entire world's liquid fuels consumption just vanished from the market overnight. But it's not just the skyrocketing cost of the oil itself. We're also dealing with a massive 40 to 50% spike in global shipping freight rates. Because the strait is deemed way too dangerous, commercial ships are being forced to reroute all the way down and around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. That detour adds 15 to 20 days to transit times. It massively inflates freight costs, delays critical deliveries, and completely chokes the working capital of businesses all over the world. Which brings us to Section 4, India's economic vulnerability, the shift from macro data to micro pain. As a nation relying on imports for roughly 90% of its crude oil, India is uniquely exposed to this exact kind of global shock. Let's break down what that vulnerability actually feels like on the ground. On the macro side, you have the HSBC Purchasing Managers Index dropping to a 45-month low, and the current account deficit is widening. That sounds academic, right? But look at the micro reality, the daily pain for Indian households. Commercial LPG prices have surged. Everyday staples, like Amul raising milk prices, are getting more expensive. And the rupee has taken a historic slide down to 95.88 against the US dollar. Imported inflation is quietly shrinking the bank accounts of the common citizen. Now, you might be wondering, why hasn't the price of petrol at the local pump completely skyrocketed yet? Well, it's because of this number right here, 1,000 crore rupees. That is the staggering financial loss being absorbed every single day by India's oil marketing companies. They're taking a massive hit to intentionally prevent catastrophic retail fuel price hikes. But let's be realistic, that is a financial buffer that simply cannot last forever. And we are already seeing the pain bleed out into the manufacturing sector. It's a brutal trade-off right now. Heavy industry gas diversion versus an MSME crisis. To keep the massive, critical heavy industries running, energy is actively being diverted away from micro, small, and medium enterprises. The direct result? Massive manufacturing hubs, like the ceramics industry in Morbi and the textile mills in Surat, are being forced to scale down or shut their doors completely. Section 5. Is India prepared? Let's take a look at the defensive strategies currently in motion. New Delhi certainly isn't just sitting back and watching this happen. To understand their proactive steps, you have to look at India's exact exposure. Before this war kicked off, 40% of India's oil imports came via the Strait of Hormuz. That means 60% was already coming from non-Hormuz routes. This existing diversification is quite literally the foundation of India's survival strategy right now. Leaning into and expanding those alternative routes is absolutely critical. So here is the rapid-fire strategic playbook the Indian government is executing. First, they are aggressively sourcing crude from non-Gulf suppliers, places like Russia, the US, and Brazil. Second, they've actually deployed Indian Navy warships to actively escort cargo ships, especially after a highly concerning attack on an Indian-flagged vessel. Third, they are pushing hard to advance the international north-south transport corridor to physically bypass these traditional choke points. And finally, looking internally, they are accelerating the Bio-E3 policy, trying to replace petroleum-based chemicals with bio-based alternatives wherever possible. Finally, Section 6, the future of Asia at stake. Are we looking at a new world order? As we try to look past the immediate panic of this crisis, we have to recognize the long-term global consequences, including entirely new defensive economic structures. For example, look at the proposed sovereign maritime insurance fund. Because global insurers are slapping massive 40 to 50% war risk premium spikes on shipping, India is looking at creating a state-backed entity just to protect its vessels. This is a crucial defense mechanism. It's all about making sure that this new geopolitical tax on shipping doesn't completely sink India's global trade during a prolonged period of warfare. Because the fundamental roles of the sea, they are changing as we speak. We now have a situation where U.S. naval blockade is aggressively redirecting commercial ships, while simultaneously Iran is instituting its own management protocols, selectively allowing allied vessels like Chinese-owned ships to pass through the strait. Access to the world's most critical waterway is no longer about the rules of free trade. It is increasingly and strictly dictated by geopolitical alignment. Which brings us to our final thought. Think about the immense scale of what we've just covered. From naval deployments and burning oil fields to inflation protests and entirely shifting global alliances. The battle for energy is no longer regional. It is the struggle that could redefine the future of the world. So will this crisis ultimately accelerate our shift away from fossil fuels? Or will it plunge us into a new, incredibly tense, prolonged Cold War over maritime routes? That is the critical question we all need to be asking moving forward. Thanks for exploring this complex issue with me today.